Hello and welcome to World History Encyclopedia. My name is Kelly, and today I am joined by author and scholar Anthony Kaldellis. Anthony is a professor in the Department of Classics at the University of Chicago, and his research explores the history, culture, and literature of the East Roman Empire from antiquity to the 15th century. Today, we get to chat to Anthony all about his new book, The New Roman Empire, A History of Byzantium, published by Oxford University Press. Thank you so much for joining me today. I can't wait to talk to you all about your new book.
Thank you for inviting me, Kelly.
So let's start off with what your book is all about.
It's all about the history of the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as Byzantium, from beginning to end. So this is from the 4th century to the 15th. It's a story of almost 1,200 years. And the book is a fairly traditional history in that it has a narrative, but that narrative is embedded within an analysis of political, economic, and social structures that were dominant at every time. There's also a significant element of religious history. Byzantium is the kind of matrix of the Orthodox Christian religion. So all of those elements come together in that story. It's a very long story. It does take 900 pages to tell in proper detail. So that's what the book is.
Right. So you've not sort of just done a general introduction to the empire, but you've really gone deep into all of the aspects of it.
That's right. So there's only one book every generation or two of this sort that comes out in my field that is a single author monograph history. Usually we tend to produce short introductions, concise histories, and obviously those are easier to produce, and they kind of encapsulate, what that historian was trying to, do at that particular moment. But it's very difficult in 150 pages to do anything more than just kind of skim the highlights. And you're kind of jumping from peak to peak and, famous emperor to famous event. And it's very difficult to see how all these things are interconnected on the ground. Like you don't have the space, right? The capacity to talk about the terrain below the heights, right, where everything is interconnected and all the valleys and crags and so forth. So in a history of this size, you can do that.
Absolutely, because I feel like definitely I've noticed maybe in the last 20-ish years, there's been that sort of shift from looking at only the rulers and the highest people in ancient history and trying to focus more on the everyday people. Did you get that opportunity as well in this book? So you've been able to really look at sort of the Byzantium as a whole rather than just those higher level people?
Absolutely. And we all are trying to do this more and more. It is difficult to do. Obviously, most of our sources are about the high and mighty. But there's a considerable emphasis in the book on demography and economy and how the whole kind of superstructure of the East Roman state depended on and rested on the productivity and the taxes and the contributions of people just across the territories from southern Italy to the Caucasus. This is and in the early period down to Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. So I do try to keep in mind the circumstances under which these people were living, the majority of the population, and also why they were willing to go along with what this state was asking them to do at any time. So I'm one of those historians who believes that there is a kind of back and forth is a kind of dialectical exchange between rulers and subjects, even in empires. And there are limits on what either side can do without sort of jeopardizing the whole project. There's a kind of delicate balance that they have to maintain. And I think that this is one of those states that managed to maintain that balance for the longest period. I mean, in history, is this 1,200 years of, by the way, this is some very dangerous years to live through, like the whole Middle Ages, in a part of the world that's also a very dangerous place to be, right? This is like right where Africa, Europe and Asia meet, and like that's where it's situated. And this is like a crossroads of peoples and cultures and armies and just religions is going back and forth. So the fact that they managed to keep it together for that long is an interesting lesson in itself.
So was there sort of one main factor that you found that enabled it to continue on for so long, or was there numerous factors working together?
The latter, obviously. But if I had to pick one that is relatively unique in the book, that is, it hasn't really been highlighted that much in the field so far, but it's the picture that emerged as I looked at the sources again and all the recent scholarship. And I think it really was this kind of back and forth communication between the authorities in Constantinople and the provincial population, where the authorities projected this persona of accountability and responsiveness. That is, we are here to do things for you, and also constantly reminding their subjects that the taxes were being collected for the common good, for public, for defense and reasons like that, and not for the private enjoyment of the ruling class. The ruling class is not a hereditary aristocracy for the most part. I mean, you do have families that maintain their power for a long time, obviously, but so it's not like this caste system or feudal system or anything like that. And on the other hand, the productive population. Remember, in these societies, it takes about 8 or 9 people working the land or with animals to support one person who doesn't, right? So the vast majority of the population is agricultural, and they're having to pay these taxes. So they can resist. And so there are lots of moments of resistance when emperors go too far. Provincial armies, often reflecting their communities or local communities, just resist and put another emperor on the throne. So this happens pretty often. Emperors who became unpopular, were deposed or murdered. About 40% of them. Yes, yes, because there's no right to the throne either. So being in charge is like an ongoing referendum. You start to get unpopular, and anyway, so there was this back and forth in terms of power. It wasn't all top down.
Right, brilliant. And so, did you decide to write this book now because it's been a while since the last time that a book like this has been published?
I mean, that justified writing the book. The reason I wrote it is because an editor at Oxford asked me to. Yes, and I said no at first because it was just like there's no way. It took me about a year to come around to the decision to do it. Once I realized that so much had changed since the last book that anyone thought was like a statement in the field. And anyway, it's a complicated. I won't get into the bibliography, but many institutions and schools and scholars were using a book that was essentially from 1940 or 1952. It was a second edition of it. That's the one that we were using. So it's like 70 years ago. And everything had changed in the meantime. Anyway, so yes, it was time.
Yeah, if I saw that in the bibliography of one of my students' essays, I'd probably be like, oh, maybe find something a little bit more recent than this.
Yes.
So did you, obviously you realized that there was a whole lot of changes that had happened since that last book. Whilst you were researching, did you find anything surprising that you didn't realize during that sort of process?
Well, so I've been trying to keep up with, all 12 centuries of my field. On and off, during the few decades that I've been working in this field. So I don't think I was surprised by anything specific that I found. I did have to research some areas that I wasn't so up to speed on, but it's not like I was terribly surprised by that. What I did find striking, probably what made the biggest impression on me, was how much good work so many of my colleagues have been doing in this field. And I'm referring specifically to younger scholars who are, often they're like overturning the pieties of the past or, conventional wisdom. They're doing a lot of good work. And this has surprised me that they're continuing to do that under professional conditions that are not ideal, right? Precarious work, lacking benefits, not knowing where you're going to be employed next year. I'm one of the very lucky ones who, got a good academic position out of grad school and have had one ever since. And so I really, really feel for the younger generation and relied on their work and cited it, wherever I could. But I don't know how sustainable this model is for much longer. I mean, what sort of neoliberal austerity is doing to universities around the world is sort of sad to see. So I was very proud of all my, especially junior colleagues.
That's brilliant. That's really nice to hear. Obviously, that you were able to incorporate this incredible research that younger scholars are doing. So often with empires and kingdoms, we get this narrative of rise and fall, or rise, decline, and fall. But that's not something that you have employed in your book. Can you tell us a bit about how you've sort of approached it instead?
Sure. Well, the narrative of rise and decline, so the canonical model is the Roman Empire, right? So when we're talking about the fall of empires, we mean Rome 90% of the time and 10% everything else, right? And the 10% is usually, are we like Rome? In any period of history, it's like, are we like Rome? Okay. The problem with my field is that the period that I study has canonically, for the past 2 or 3 centuries, been identified as the period of the decline and fall of Rome. So like in Enlightenment historiography, like Edward Gibbon or Montesquieu, his model, like Byzantium literally was the decline and fall phase, right? Not just for like political and military reasons and what you would imagine, but also like the whole culture was a kind of degenerate, either it was politically despotic or oppressive, and its religion was superstitious and whatever, intolerant and so forth. So obviously, 20th century historians dispense with a lot of that, but we haven't put anything really in its place. So, I think it's not enough to simply protest and complain, lodge your protest when someone uses the word decline. I mean, obviously, there were phases of decline. You can't avoid that. And if there weren't, this thing would still be with us, and it's not, right? But in terms of sort of the popular perception of what this is, what it was, what does it mean for us as a state, among other things? I mean, it means a lot of things to different people. It's, as I said, the kind of birth culture of Greek Orthodoxy, or the Orthodox Church, and its theologies and so forth. It also created Roman law as we know it. That's a whole other story. You think of Hagia Sophia also, like the most magnificent church in the world, or building, in fact, for very many centuries during the Middle Ages. Fine. But I think a case can be made that its sheer resilience is the lesson to be learned here. That is the fact that it actually managed to survive for that long in those circumstances, which I mentioned earlier, right? So rather than seeing it as decline and fall, I think we should flip that on its head and see it very precisely as a system that, for its time and the circumstances and political and religious ideologies that were dominant at the time, was extremely adept at surviving crises. And so in terms of resilience and sheer endurance, it was doing something right rather than wrong. And in fact, I could make the case that the periods of decline that it saw, that is the shocks that it suffered that caused it to lose territories and eventually disappear, were largely exogenous. In other words, things striking it from the outside, often without warning. Like the Arab conquest of the 7th century, that wasn't something that anybody could reasonably foresee or plan for. Whereas when it wasn't being subject to pretty intense outside pressure, its internal tendencies were toward economic and demographic growth, and also cultural, regeneration. So that its endogenous factors tended toward, growth and stability. And so in that sense, perhaps you can fault them for not being ready for these outside shocks that came their way at various times. But in terms of the structure of the culture and this kind of political arrangement between its ruling elites and the population at large, I think it was fairly well positioned for stability and slow growth. Slow growth, not Alexander the Great kind of conquest or anything like that, which they weren't terribly impressed with, but slow growth.
Right. That's so interesting. So would you say then that this sort of connection with decline and fall is the reason why Byzantium has such a negative sort of reputation in Western scholarship, or is there something else going on there?
Yeah, so there are two reasons why that came about. And by the way, many people in your audience will know that the term Byzantine, just in the dictionary, refers to something that's very complex and convoluted, so complex that it's designed to exclude people from understanding it or working its systems, and that it's also somewhat malicious. In fact, last year I had to wage a battle with a different field altogether. This is computer programmers who were using the term Byzantine in their professional publications to refer to malicious software. A particular type of program that is not what it appears to be, but is acting in bad faith. So these associations and connotations have sort of penetrated pretty deeply. So there are largely two reasons why this came about. The first is that for a long period in the Middle Ages, so medieval Western Europeans, so we're talking about people in Italy north of Rome and north of Rome, and then also in France and the German Empire. They were doing two couple of things. One is they were appropriating sort of cultural practices and prestige practices from the Eastern Empire. Things like the Roman imperial title and how do you perform being a Roman emperor? Right? But also many, things like Roman law, which, as I said, was codified in the East, in Constantinople by Justinian in the 6th century, rediscovered in the West in the later 12th century and sort of appropriated, right? Also, very many aspects of the Christian religion, from practice to doctrine to texts to whatever. And each time these things were appropriated in the West, they were recast as belonging inherently, sort of naturally, to Western Europeans. And these Eastern Romans, whom they called Greeks, dismissively, this was not a flattering term in the Western Middle Ages, were no longer worthy of them. Right? I'll give you an example from a bit later. Classical Greek literature, right? So all ancient Greek literature that we have in Greek, we have because it was copied, laboriously and carefully throughout this East Roman millennium, right? They were the only Greek speakers around. And in the 15th century, mostly, it kind of passed over to Italy, and the Italian humanists received it, right? Because only Eastern or Greek scholars could work with it at the time. Very few people in Italy could even read Greek. Well, within a century, the classical Greek texts had been appropriated as something that was kind of inherent to Western scholarship, humanism, and they were claiming that the East is no longer worthy of it because they've been barbarized completely. Right? So, in other words, for Europe to kind of invent itself as being kind of Roman imperial in some way, Christian Orthodox in some way, as having access to classical Greek learning in some way, they did it in a way that denied that those Easterners had a right to it. And in order to do that, they had to present them as being sort of false Romans, but rather they were deceitful Greeks, bad Christians. They either didn't respect the Pope, or their religion was too superstitious, or whatever, depending on the period. And that their language, their Greek, was barbarized and degenerate, right? So Byzantium had to become this package. It was like the dark mirror of Europe, It's where you take all of the things that later Europe, like Enlightenment Europe and later, took pride in, and there's their negative, reverse negative image, like everything that was wrong with those things. Right? So that's one way that Byzantium was imbued with all of these negative traits. The other one was simply that, well, I mean, in the Enlightenment, so a lot of these thinkers, political theorists and the philosophers and so forth, well, they couldn't speak very candidly about their own kings and archbishops or popes or whatever. And so Byzantium, at the time they called it the Empire of the Greeks, Byzantium is a slightly later term, it just became a convenient way for talking about all of these dysfunctions of theocracy, or a society that lacks civic virtue or is despotic, or where priests have too much power and so forth. So it was just kind of like a handy surrogate for discussion. Yeah. And it just kind of, it was left holding that image.
That's so interesting. So it's almost like using that as like a keyword, like, oh, we can't use the real names, we'll use them instead, but you know what I'm actually talking about. And then it's sort of just...
Oh, yeah. And it became established in like all the European languages. So I mentioned earlier what Byzantine means in English. But like I found that in Italy, in the later half of the 19th century and into the fascist period in Italy, Byzantium was a code word for all the dysfunctions of the Italian bureaucracy, especially in like the south of Italy. So like what today we consider like the mafia land, like all that, they just called it, Byzantium, like it was their code for that. Yeah, yeah. And there were periods where, like in France, Byzantium was like a code word for like Oriental decadence, which for the French wasn't always a bad thing. Like, honestly, there was 100 years ago, there's a very prominent Byzantinist, Charles Deal, and he thought that he was rehabilitating Byzantium by identifying it with Oriental decadence. Like, isn't that nice and exotic?
Yeah, wow.
Yes, thank you.
That's so interesting. And I guess that's all things now that you're like, well, let's refocus on what Byzantium actually is, which is not
right. No, this is a real history. There are no dragons or elves in here. They're real people doing real things. It's actually a very sober, sort of level-headed civilization for the most part. Anyway, they knew what they were doing. They're real people you can understand and identify with. It's not this exotic, mystical land of domes and glittering gold. I mean, yeah, they had all that, but you don't identify them with that.
Brilliant. Okay, well, that's probably a great place to leave off. Anthony, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure talking to you about your new book.
Thank you, Kelly, for willing to speak with me about Byzantium. And I hope people are willing to, this civilization lasted for 1,000 years, so give it some of your time and read some of the book. I've tried to make it very accessible to everyone. So thank you, Kelly.
Which is great to hear. So if you're looking to purchase the book, you will be able to find the link down below to Oxford University Press. Thank you so much.
Take care.
This episode was brought to you by World History Encyclopedia. For more great articles and interactive content, head to our website via the link below. If you like my sweater, you can find this design and a bunch more in our shop at worldhistory.store, or you can find a link for it down below. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you soon with another video.